Well, hello, New York. So, a couple things you need to know before we start this evening. We are taping tonight for Barnes & Noble's YouTube channel because this lovely guy was very nice and did an interview for Long Island for the hardcover for the Poured Over podcast. So we are still taping. And the other piece you need to know is 5 weeks ago, we were in Los Angeles and we did a version of a conversation about Long Island that was also supposed to go up, and this is the first time I'm telling you this, that was also supposed to go up on the Barnes & Noble YouTube channel. And for various reasons, the footage was lost. But at the time, well, hold on, you're still going to benefit. But at the time, we thought, oh no, there are going to be two videos of the same person. And the only difference would be the backdrop, and it would be the same event. And that just seemed like a cheat. And it's not often that an author and an interviewer get to speak to each other 5 weeks apart. And I thought, well, I've got to up my game then, because this is Colm Tóibín, and I cannot phone it in, right? So as we're leaving Los Angeles, I said, oh, hey, you know, chances are good I'm not going to read Thomas Mann, and I'm not sure I have the strength to do Henry James again. I did read the Bostonians because of this man and the master. And I have a warm, fuzzy spot for the Blackwater Lightship and the South and the Heather Blazing, which are books that are really kind of part of who I am as a bookseller now. And if you've listened to Poured Over, you know I have a running joke about having never read Middlemarch. And that ends today. I finished it. I finished it on Tuesday night. Because the look on this man's face as we were leaving Los Angeles when I said, no, I'll read Middlemarch. And he came back with, well, you could just do the start of it. And I said, no, actually, I can't do that. That's not how I'm programmed. So 785 pages later, I have feelings. So you're going to get a little bit of Middlemarch in this conversation as well. And I promise, it does lead to Long Island. It does lead to Brooklyn, because I have some feelings about Middlemarch that make me think quite a lot of some of the men in Long Island, actually. And you and I haven't had a chance to really talk about the men in Long Island. So that's all a long, convoluted way of saying, I know Colm Tóibín needs no introduction to a New York crowd, but you needed a little bit of background before we started this event. The other thing is, too, when we're taping live, we do like to take audience questions, but we ask you to write them on index cards. So if you haven't received an index card yet from Anthony, he's happy to deliver them. He's happy to pick them up as we go. I like to work in your questions as I go. I think it's way more interesting than holding them till the end, because chances are good I might not have to ask my question because you've asked it. So it makes for a much more interesting, fun kind of way to do an event, and keep us all sort of in the middle of things. And then, of course, there will be a book signing at the end. But, and this is my proof, I broke it. I broke the binding. But I did.
You're great.
I did.
You're really great.
I really, in 5 weeks.
You're an example to everyone.
I did, and I liked it so much more than I expected to. And I know, wait, don't make that face.
I
Don't
will.
make that face. I really, no, I got very invested very quickly, which I was not expecting. And it felt like a really modern novel. And remind me what year this was written in?
But you're
18 something, right? Okay.
Well, I suppose 1872, I suppose.
All right. It feels like I'm reading something that's speaking to the exact moment we're in. A lot of ego and a lot of gossip and a lot of how do we rebuild a thing and how do we build and reform and how do I keep my place in the world. There's a lot of respectability. There was so much more happening than I thought there would be. And then the fact that she published it in serial, it goes at this 100-page gallop. And I was really not expecting that. I was really, really not expecting that. And you've been teaching Middlemarch for a really long time, yeah?
Yeah. I have.
But you love this book in ways that I will get to, I think.
Yes, I suppose one of the things about it is if you're Irish, and perhaps it's the same if you're American, it just gives you a 19th century that you don't have any other idea of, really, the extraordinary idea of slow progress. What slow progress actually means and looks like in a society. So that even it is an historical novel. I mean, that it begins to be set in the first Reform Act of 1832 and the building of the railways. So 40 years later, she's looking back with great irony. Imagine when there were no railways and people were wondering what these new things would do to the landscape, do to the actual society. Everyone knew by the time the book came out And we have a great example of that because Merton Densher, in The Age of Innocence, Edith Wharton's novel, opens a box of books that comes from London and finds this new novel by George Eliot called Middlemarch. And of course, Middlemarch was also going to establish for once and for all what was being done to women under the guise of, I suppose, gentility.
Right.
That, in other words, Dorothea's mind has an extraordinary strength to it. But also her passionate nature. Also the way in which she simply doesn't understand that Casaubon's his interest in being a scholar is a sort of foolishness on his part.
Right.
And but it is I think the building of the character and the dealing with time that you have these characters. And then she wants panorama. She could easily have made a novel out of the simple business of a passionate young woman deciding to marry an elderly scholar and how that marriage would pan out. To some extent, that's what Henry James decided later to do. I mean, not very long after, to do in Portrait of a Lady, that he would stick to one story. And James, he reviewed Middlemarch, saying, you know, this novel is not compact, but when was panorama ever compact? So she wants to go then into the town of Middlemarch. She wants to see who's there. She wants to see the various... there's a hypocrite living there. But there's also a young woman...
Only one?
Well, pretty good one. And then there's the whole idea of the doctor. And again, it's a lovely thing, the arrival of the stethoscope. And you imagine the world without one. And then you imagine some doctors thinking that new thing won't work. You know, the argument will never stop over medical science, over, you know. And then, of course, Lydgate has the stethoscope. And then you watch Lydgate. Can Lydgate be corrupted? You know, is Lydgate as, you know, if everyone is interested in reform, that's not a novel. If everyone is interested in reform and some people get challenged and get, you know, the business of reform itself is dramatized. But in the background somewhere is the extraordinary First Reform Act of 1832, Second Reform Act, of 1864, just the idea that more and more people are being allowed to vote for their parliament and more people are being allowed to stand for parliament. But this is not the novel. If Trollope wrote it, it would be. But this is what it means to live in a society that is really going through 1,000 years of slow progress, and what a novel looks like under those conditions.
So is this where we get to say novels are in fact political creatures and we can all stop pretending they're not?
I think with George Eliot in Middlemarch and also in Daniel Deronda. In Daniel Deronda, even more, written a few years later, she has a sense of the future. And the idea of someone writing about Zionism in the 1870s and about a young man who's going to devote his life to it is a sort of prophecy. In the case of Middlemarch, I think she's settling for a bit less and getting a bit more. In other words, I think the less obvious a political strain in a novel is, sometimes you can get a nourishment from just referring to things and letting them go. I think it will be very difficult in the future there's a certain name, I won't say the name, but it's a name that I think will be better left out of novels of the future. That if we see that name of someone, you know, who wins elections, it seems, and even when he didn't win, he wins, that it would be very hard for novelists to start putting that name into the novel and thinking this is a political book. I think the less you put the name in, you might get more, not just life in the book, felt life, but a sense of politics as the way in which life went on in certain ways despite him rather than because of him. But I'm less sure about that, obviously, as time goes on.
Well, luckily we don't have to solve that tonight. But the men in Middlemarch, they want nothing more than to be respectable. They want nothing more to make their mark. The men in Middlemarch are messy. They are so messy. They are not who they think they are.
But isn't Ladislaw, isn't he so beautiful?
Yes, he is.
He's got
He's
a
delightful.
noble nature.
He's
and
delightful.
when we see him in Rome with his friends who are watching Dorothea, we have a sense of him as someone who loves beauty, but is also interested in progress. And there's a lovely moment where the minute Casaubon becomes aware of him as his cousin, or it becomes really, that is the man for Dorothea. And then he sets about, you know, demanding that she never has anything to do with him. There's also the lovely, isn't there, the first suitor. It's almost like something from a folk tale. The first man who loved Dorothea was a local landlord or landowner who really had no no nature other than a sweet one. And that idea in a novel also of if a character only has one characteristic, then they won't get to marry the heroine. They need two characteristics. Casaubon has far too many characteristics, but the first, you're going to help me with his name, the first, who marries her sister.
Oh, James.
Yeah, that he's so, it's exactly what Henry James took up with Lord Warburton in Portrait of a Lady. James stole so much and very beautifully from Middlemarch, but with that idea that for her to marry, it will be a most complex business. She will first have to turn down someone entirely suitable and then perversely choose wrong. And all the time, Ladislaw is wandering up and down with his beautiful manners and his perfect skin.
Yeah, and then he still runs away.
Yeah.
I mean, get a spine, my friend. Really.
Oh, come on.
He needed a time. Listen, he's a young man. He can grow a spine. Casaubon. All right, how many of you read Middlemarch, right? Okay, you know that point with the codicil? I texted a friend in the middle of the night and said, I hate this guy. That was not a response I was expecting to have to Middlemarch, but I was really, I was so mad. The codicil where he's trying to control things after he dies. Come on.
We need to give the plot away here.
Well, I think it's
Obviously-
fair. The
obviously
book's
he
been
is
around for a while.
he has married a young, clever woman who presumes that she can help him in his work. One of the key essays, I think, about that would help you with this book is an essay by Virginia Woolf called On Not Knowing Greek. Because one of the things done to women in the 19th century was when everyone else was getting a classical education, women didn't get to learn Greek, even women whose fathers were famous scholars. So that Dorothea doesn't have Greek. And because she doesn't have Greek, then there are things she's not able to help him with.
Yep.
And he's attempting to write this extraordinary book about mythology and a key to all the mythologies. And so he doesn't want her to help him.
Right.
So the idea that she thought she was going to share in his work, that's just gone. But then she realizes there's a beautiful moment in Rome where his Ladislaw and his friend, but this Ladislaw says to her, the Germans have superseded what Casaubon is doing in their scholarship. His book is of really no value at all, even though it isn't finished. When it is finished, it won't be of any value. And the reader goes, I mean, it's like something in Greek theatre or Shakespeare. You go, oh, you mean the whole point of him is missing then?
Yeah.
He also turns out to be nasty. There are times when he's just so mean to her. And it begins also with, again, you're always, I think, looking for images to see what's she working with. And of course, Dorothea wants to design cleaner houses for people who are working on the land. She comes with drawings of new sort of houses they should build. I mean, it isn't that she wants reform in some abstract way. She has drawings of the reform she wishes to make, which her sister doesn't have, for example.
Right.
So it really singles her out as someone who comes into this. And see, all the time you're sort of circling the idea of who was George Eliot? What a complex figure she must have been to have made all this passion. And all this passion spent, all this thwarted passion, and also all this politics. That, in other words, there's a wonderful moment early on in the book, I think, when there's a meeting of the town council, and it really is up to the new Dr. Lydgate to vote in a certain way so that he will have allies in the future for things he will want to do in the town. If he doesn't vote this way, but it's the wrong way to vote. And I think anyone who's been through that feeling of, I know what I'm doing is wrong, but if I go all out to be really good and wholesome and honourable, I will lose allies. And you watch him being compromised in a small town in this way. And anyone who writes small town novels should look carefully at this particular scene, where it isn't that he does anything bad, it is that the time is not ripe for heroism. And then we watch him, of course. She writes very well about, I think, a really important matter, which should be more in novels, what it's like to run out of money. And so as the money gets spent in the house and the poor doctor is desperately trying to make more money, and do all his research, realizing that they're actually going to go broke. They're actually, and that idea of just every month counting up the amount of money, realizing they're going to have to sell furniture. We have to remember as well that the idea of furniture then was a sort of capital. Having your furniture equal to having your house. And then there's a small matter of Bulstrode. I mean, how did you feel?
The banker.
How did you feel?
He made my skin crawl. And again, I realize I'm talking about a fictional character who is 200-something years old. I mean, but at the same time, I didn't have a great feeling when we met him. And I didn't know whose downfall he was going to be responsible for. But I also wasn't sad when he went tumbling down the hill too, because really he was a creep. He was an opportunistic creep, and I was just like, I hope you end up living in a gutter somewhere. And again, the fact that I was that invested, and Lydgate, I felt a little bad for him, but not as bad as I might, because I was kind of like, well, you're an adult, you know what you're doing.
I hope you don't have retrograde views on Mary Garth or Fred.
No, I don't have big feelings about either of them. I sort of
Aw.
felt like they were a distraction from what
I
I
think
was
she
sort
wanted
of.
someone at the center of the book who was just good. Who just
They're
tried to do
lovely.
good all the time.
No,
and then
they're
Fred is so useless, and then it's about buying a horse. He doesn't know how to buy
I-
a horse. And this is
I-
England.
I sort of read around them a little bit.
Oh.
Sorry. Listen, I'm not.
No,
a
you see,
perfect
I love
reader.
all that business of she introduces something new, and instead of it seeming to be systematic, I think this is the important thing, maybe, that instead of it, each character, instead of becoming systematic or emblematic or examples of a sort of way England is going, she gives each one a sort of a sense of, I suppose, a sense of immediate presence. A sense of desires that the reader begins to follow and are thwarted each desire in a very different sort of way. Because you see, what I wanted all the time was Lydgate and Dorothea. But that was never.
That was never.
That was
No,
never. Isn't that
was
sad?
never. And also Rosamund, bad friend. Bad friend.
I know. No, I agree with you about that.
Very
yeah.
bad friend.
I
Like, come
know.
on, sisterhood. Just a time. Not.
I know.
Was not happy with that. But hey, speaking of people who write small town novels, there is kind of a direct line from Middlemarch, in a way,
Well,
to Long Island and to Brooklyn and Enniscorthy. Yeah.
I will hold on now. I'm not claiming. You want to be very afraid now to start claiming. But the big argument. I mean, let's say that if you think of the 1870s in England, there must have been many other arguments, but I can't think of one other than the argument about how to end a novel. And since the novel was such an important element in English life,
Yeah.
this business. At the very end of Middlemarch, after all this serialization, after all this stuff, you've got all these different characters, and they're all young, except Casaubon, who's dead.
And not soon enough.
And not soon enough. But they were all young when the novel started. So how do they end? What happens to the next 30 years for them?
I did love that ending. I
You
thought
did?
the ending was very satisfying and very organic. It didn't feel tacked on, and it didn't feel. It was a nice surprise. I wasn't expecting it.
No, it was lovely to know that Ladislaw ends up in Parliament, and those beautiful sentences about what sort of life Dorothea lived, although it was a life in the private realm, nonetheless it was one. But come on, give us all a break. If everyone starts doing this, so you have like Moby Dick, and this is how everyone in
No,
Moby Dick.
it's
come
not
on,
gonna work.
come on,
No,
you know,
it's
like
not gonna
like
work
you
that.
can't do it.
Can't.
So,
Sorry, no.
So
Nope.
obviously, Henry James was appalled by it because he felt the whole subtlety of building these characters that seemed to live in the now, in the now of the last paragraph, to tell the reader, oh, don't worry, I'm going to tell you everything. That the novel is not merely going to rhythmically begin to come down, or it's not going to end on an image that seems infinitely mysterious, and when you put the book down, even more so. No, I'm going to tell you everything. I'm going to each one, I'm going to give them a line. So when James came, again with serialization, to the end of Portrait of a Lady, he was really like, what do you do with Isabel Archer at the end of Portrait of a Lady? Now, again, giving the plot away, I mean, does she run off with Caspar Goodwood? He wants her to. And the reader goes, if she does, where does she run off to? Could it go, that morning, Isabel decided she would throw her lot in with Caspar Goodwood. He was waiting outside in a carriage. She didn't take any luggage. She didn't feel she'd need any. And they went straight to the boat, and she became, in later years, a very good person in New York, where she founded hospitals for foundlings, or she was involved with the Metropolitan Museum, and all the things she could have done, which at the end of Age of Innocence, Edith Wharton has, telling us all the things that Merton Densher did in the years afterwards. He was on the board of the Met, all those things. And so James has a big problem. What else might she do? Could she do nothing? Like just stay in London? But what image would he give for that? And what he decides to do is to go back to an earlier moment in the book where Gilbert Osmond, her husband, has said to her, whatever you feel about me, and you obviously dislike me, you must remember we're married. And I take that very seriously, that we set up a house together. And so you're realizing how conventional Isabel has been all the time in the book. For example, there's a moment when she comes to England first where her aunt says to her, you cannot stay up late with two men, even though one of them is your cousin. And Isabel, why? Just the custom of the country, you cannot. And Isabel says, well, it's very good to know that. And her aunt says, so as to break it. And she says, no, so as to know. But she does go to bed that night. She is a conventional figure in that sense. And so she's never going to wander the European cities with some man to whom she isn't married, or having left her husband under mysterious circumstances in Rome. But James, I mean, he really doesn't know what to do. I feel immensely sorry for him, especially now that I've got all this abusive emails from very nice readers just saying, what were you doing with the end of this book? And James got a lot of this too, but I don't think it came in the same way. I had the experience, in other words, you're coming to the end of the book. You don't want the book to end. It's unclear what she's going to do. Caspar Goodwood has been to see her. Her uncle is dead. Her cousin is dead. She's really alone in the world. And the last thing you think of is that she's going to go back to Osmond. And instead of having it from her mind, because her mind, of course, is a rich thing, you see her ruminating over so many things in Portrait of a Lady. It's the greatness of the book in some way, is the way in which her mind things can occur to her. She can see things. She can analyze things. She can miss the point of things. Now, we don't see her mind. We just have her friend, Henrietta Stackpoole, just saying to Caspar Goodwood comes to visit, she has gone back to her husband. And you think, well, that'll be fine. I'll know about it in the next chapter. There's no next chapter. Turn the page, there's no next page. And I think readers have gone crazy about this. But I honestly thought it was a valid, artistic way of handling it. In other words, that if you don't do that, you're going to have to then explain her life until the end of time.
Okay, but
I mean, what I'm saying is a novel is, I suppose, an arc rather than a line. And you've got to respect the up and down of the arc.
Yeah.
Okay, am I wrong?
No, of course you're not wrong.
Oh, no,
is that a
could be
real
right.
question?
I am, because this is an argument between George Eliot and Henry James. And of course, you have to come down to one side or the other.
You do. And I believe the ending needs to match whatever came first. So there are times where I want that one line that just makes me go, ooh. I happen to be pleasantly surprised by my response to the ending of Middlemarch. I was not, it felt a little sentimental, and I don't usually go for sentimental. Yeah. And I was just like, oh, this is nice. I like knowing what's happened to these people, because I am probably never going to visit them again.
Yeah.
But my biggest issue with endings is I just want them to be organic. I don't want to feel like someone has gotten me to a point in a story where they're like, and now we're done, wipe the hands together, peace out, thanks all for playing.
Yeah,
it needs to feel, and it's going to be different for every single book.
Yeah.
And that's so.
Could it be that it could be different for every single reader?
Yes, absolutely, because I do believe that every reader brings their own experience to a book. I mean, I remember when you told me that you were working on Long Island. We were doing another interview for the essay collection, and all of a sudden, he pulls out this notebook and says, "Oh, I'm working on a sequel to Long Island." And I said,
think it was on Zoom. Was this on
Zoom?
It
was on Zoom.
That's what I saw.
Yeah.
I showed
up
on the screen. Look what I have.
And my eyes got really big, and I was like, "I'm sorry, what is happening here? Like, what is going on?" But the way Brooklyn ends and the way we come into Long Island, I wouldn't have expected. I mean, I had no idea that you were doing this until all of a sudden here are these pages. Katie Kitamura is a novelist that I love. In each of her books, the way they end, I'm just like, yep, couldn't be any other way. Couldn't be any other way. And sometimes you even know how they're going to end. She'll tell you right in the middle that this is what's going on.
She deals with a real quietness in the middle of a book. So it's not as though she builds up great plot or indeed expectations of action. But what she does, I think particularly, is she builds up a sense of something impending or looming, but that's emotional and psychological. And so therefore, I envy her, because I think you could get an ending much easier that way if the middle of the book is like that. There's often someone in a restaurant is with someone else in a restaurant. There's something else going on in the restaurant. Whatever it is holding your attention massively. But yet, no.
You know what I'm talking about.
I do.
Okay. I do. We have to give people a little bit of Long Island, though, because, they didn't know they were getting Middlemarch. They did not know they were part of a plot to talk about George Eliot. So I want to come back, though, and Escorthy for a second, because I I love this place, and my only experience of this place is you. And I will say, I have been reading Colm's novels since I was a baby bookseller, and I mean a baby bookseller. And The South was published first as a trade paperback original in the United States when these things were not really done. There was like vintage contemporaries, and then occasionally, and they were all very pastel-y, very Miami Vice. And then you would get something, and I'm thinking, who is this guy, and what is this book, and who is this woman, and hello. And The Blackwater Lightship, too, from the late 90s, that's a book that I still hold very, very close. And then, of course, Brooklyn. I mean, we all experienced Brooklyn and had our brains broken wide open. And now we have Eilish as an adult. And I go back to my earlier point about the men in Middlemarch. The men in Long Island are messy. And I say that respectfully, but they are messy. And, you know, you and I have talked in the past, too, about sort of how the women around you when you were growing up, they had all the stories and all the secrets, and the men sort of sat there and didn't really say a lot, or they would talk about sports. But really, they didn't say a lot. And I mean, here you are. You're reading Middlemarch. You're reading Henry James. You're reading all of this stuff as a young man, and yet it's set against the men who say nothing.
I mean, there are two things to say.
Yeah.
There are three things to say, but there are two things to say first. Is that that business of men and women comes really out of my experience, which is that, you know, in our house, say on a Sunday, my mother had two younger sisters who didn't marry until later, so they would be around and they were very interested in everything, but they could really talk about clothes forever, a coat. And my father had a sister who was often around. My two siblings are girls. There could be friends in. There could be a room upstairs. My parents' bedroom could be filled with women talking, mainly about a coat or a skirt. Auntie Harriet almost bought a coat in Dublin. And then there'd be a row over the coat that she almost bought, where my mother would say, but Harry, green doesn't suit you. And Harry would say, what? But this is... And so a row would begin about green until someone would put me out of the room because I was listening too closely. And downstairs, my father, his brothers, my own brother, my older brother, and some other man could be sitting, I mean, really sitting there, smoking in an old-fashioned way. And they'd be talking about some goal. Some goal, I didn't say idiot. Some goal someone scored on Sunday. That was a good goal on Sunday. You know, the other one would say, oh, it was. And then the third one could say, oh, well, the other goal was good as well. And then the two could, oh, you're right about that. I said, this has to end. Like, when are these men going? Like this. And you try and go back upstairs and get into the room. So that obviously if you're writing novels, I mean, unless you're Samuel Beckett, where what's below is social realism, you know, there's men going on about that, you know, you find there's much more to work from in the first one. But I suppose the second thing is the George Eliot business of social change and how you register social change in a novel is really useful because she does it with such subtlety and care that it means you can try it and see. For example, I think feminism is one where are there feminists in Long Island? And the answer is, in Enniscorthy when I was growing up, all of those ideas got into our house, and I don't know how. Because they weren't reading the books, my mother and her sisters and her friends. They weren't reading Kate Millett. They weren't reading Germaine Greer. And they were obviously still Catholics, but somehow or other the idea that you would educate your daughters in the same way as you would your sons, and that you would make your sons wash up and do the dishwashing, and as much as the girl. Like those little things in the house that would not have happened a generation earlier ended up making a big difference. But I'm not just talking about that. I'm talking about women starting to read books for themselves. My mother moving from the New York Times, the Irish Press to the Irish Times would be like someone here moving from the New York Post to the New York Times. A woman doing this on her own, you know, in a household where that newspaper wasn't read, and going through the paper really carefully on a Sunday, reading articles, informing herself. All of that was part of my life.
Your
but
mother
it wouldn't
read
be called politics then, you know.
Right. But your mother also read Edna O'Brien's The Girls and John McGahern, and your mother was reading books that were technically banned.
Yes, and so were her friends. But with that idea of wanting to read, you know, banned books, dirty books, it was sort of part of the deal. Those writers were, you know, people thought they had something interesting to say. The banning almost improved the way in which they were savoured, you know. it was never taken very seriously. I mean, you couldn't get the books,
Right.
but I did find over the wardrobe upstairs in that same bedroom, Edna O'Brien's The Country Girls, John McGahern's The Dark, and John Updike's Couples, which of
Oh,
course
I
you just
remember reading
imagine
that.
in a small town in Ireland in 1962 or 3, Couples would have really opened your eyes, wouldn't it?
Oh, it was still scandalous on the coast of Massachusetts.
Was it? Yeah.
In certain circles, it was a little bit of, oh, your parents have that.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I mean,
So what I'm talking about here then is Eilish's efforts to change herself.
yeah.
Without knowing exactly what she's doing, but that every way she moves in this book in Long Island is really different to Brooklyn. Not only that she's 25 years older, but that the world has changed. And it's not merely that Watergate has happened or the Vietnam War has been on, but other things have happened that affect how women live. And I was trying to get that without mentioning it, see what I could do with that.
Well, I mean, she gets a job. She has her own car.
Yeah.
And little things that,
Yeah.
I mean, when you remember that women couldn't get bank accounts,
Yeah.
or you couldn't get a mortgage, or
Yeah.
all of these things that we take for granted, and I'm like, I'm sorry, what?
Yeah, but the job she gets is a gradual thing. You know, the man
yeah.
who owns the local garage just asks if she could come and help a bit. You
Right.
know, it's not as though she applies for something or even studies for something. So all that had to be very carefully done, so that you wouldn't feel you were getting some preacher from Ireland had arrived to tell you how American women lived in the 1970s. Do you know, like it had to be, I had to be careful with it. But nonetheless, it's an important element in the book.
You don't do polemics, though. You've never done polemics. You've always just sort of said, how do I tell a story? I mean, I'm going to go back to the South for a second. You're sitting on a train, you see a woman across from you, and you think, what's happening there? I mean, that could have been, you were covering a lot of ground.
Yeah, it's also that she leaves Ireland, the woman, in 1955, which is the year I'm born. So it's that whole idea of trying to imagine your parents' lives, of the lives they might have had. And also, there's something lovely about class in a novel where, we're from just an ordinary house and, a sort of what's called a housing estate in Ireland. It was a public housing. And suddenly in the South, I made them all really posh Protestants. I gave them a big house. I gave them loads of chances. They owned paintings and things. And there was a certain pleasure in moving out of your own, I suppose, quite reduced, circumstances. But of course, I realized once I had done it, don't do that again. Don't write a series of posh novels. So the next novel is set once more again. It's sort of ordinary life. But there was an element of that. It's like, I mean, writing a novel is partly like being about 5 and you're lying in bed at night thinking, I wonder if Auntie Harriet this is Brooklyn, my mother's younger sister, if Auntie Harriet had gone to America. You think, was she going to America? She didn't go to America, but imagine if she did, what would happen to her? How would she live? Where would she go?
Yeah.
And then you start putting in, for example, in Brooklyn, the name of the firm where her sister works is exact. The topography of the town is exact. So I started putting in real things, like you're 5 or maybe you're 6, and you're imagining further where she would go in America. And so it's the same idea of. It's also the question of homecoming has become a much more important issue now. I think it's true in Ireland. It's probably true in Mexico. I mean, I'm not talking about the current disaster as much as when flights became cheaper and you could move in and out of America, and you didn't just have to wait for a horrible phone call telling you that somebody was sick, and the phone call was costing a fortune. This is the 1950s, into the 60s, even into the 70s. You could simply be told in an email, "Get on a flight now," and you could be in Dublin the following morning.
Yep.
And I think that made a huge difference to everybody. And then you could think, if you were in America, to go home for longer, to go home for a month. And so Long Island then is the opportunity for someone to come home,
Right.
and give themselves a bit of time. And it has to be in the summer. Brooklyn and Long Island are both summer novels, because if it's in the winter, you just have to describe rain, and then you have to describe more rain, and then it was frost, and then there was mist. And then there was one nice day, but it didn't last. And, you can't have anyone near a beach. You can't have anyone even meeting on the street because they would have their head down against the rain. And so, so there are 2 summer novels. That lovely idea of coming back to Ireland at a time when at least it's going to be one nice Sunday.
Right.
And all you want in a novel, in a way, is just give your characters one nice Sunday, and then everything can happen.
And that leads me to an audience question. How did the modulation of setting factor prominently in both Brooklyn and Long Island. As a sentence-driven writer, what narrative tactics did you take to balance both setting and sentence?
I think the important thing to go back to the 19th century is the Jane Austen idea of if you have a dance, have solitude the next day. And so the character you're going to pull out of the dance is going to become notable, not for what she does at the dance, but for how she thinks about it the next day. And so that element of, it happens at the opening of Long Island, where, I mean, the opening by any standards is preposterous. And you shouldn't be allowed to do it. And I worked at not doing it. And then I thought, look, I think I can solve this once it's done by the next 8 pages. In other words, Eilish gets a big shock at the opening of the book. A man comes to tell her husband's had an affair.
The men are messy.
Yeah, men are messy.
The men are messy.
This big Irishman comes to tell her all this. Now, I have 8 pages. It's about 2 hours in time. It's about 8 pages in print to get her to do nothing. She mustn't scream. She mustn't phone anyone. She mustn't talk. She's in the house on her own. What I'm trying to do is establish the quality of her solitude. And by doing so is establish the quality of her sensibility. And if I have any action, but I do need an action. I need to do, she can't just go upstairs and downstairs again. She can't just make tea. No making tea. Too many Irish novels have making tea. No tea. She can't just look out the window wistfully. Too much of that. And so it came into my head that she would go to the phone and that she would lift up the receiver, which she would dial no number. That's satisfying. I thought, that's something she could do. It actually emphasizes, it sort of copper fastens the solitude. And the next, but those 8 pages for me become the essential thing where it's not just that it's sentence-led, it's just that you mustn't notice a sentence. There must be no sentence in those 8 pages which you would say, he's trying to write like so-and-so, or, who does he think, no noticeable sentence, no memorable action. But what's strangely happening is that you're becoming attuned to someone who thinks in a certain way and feels in a certain way. And the rest of the novel depends not on the opening 6 pages. I mean, maybe preposterous is a bit strong, but I'm not sure. But that the next 8 pages is what does the work.
I fell in love with Eilish all over again with her response to that man knocking on her door. I was just like, The marriage novel. So this is a little bit of my issue with Eliot, is I don't believe in marriage except for other people, and even then I think marriage is overrated, and I think we're still holding on to an outdated institution. And
well, this is you.
Yeah, this
I'm
is
sure.
I'm not a fan. But I will say it's good for a novel. I'm not sure how Eilish feels about. Well, I think she likes it, but I'm still not sure. I think we're holding on to something that maybe not all of us need.
Well, I'll consider that in the future. It's a whole new idea. I'd never thought of that.
I don't know. I mean, but no, this idea, though, that she is with Tony and of this marriage and is kind of claustrophobically stuck with his family in that little cul-de-sac that they build the houses on, and I'm not sure I would want to live that close to anyone. And I say this as a person who lives in the city. I live on top of my neighbors. That's different. And I love the fact that she gets to go back and figure out what matters to her. She has an impossible amount of freedom, and it was so exciting to read. And I'm not sure she thought of it as freedom right away. I don't know.
No, a term like freedom isn't in her lexicon, really.
Yeah.
I mean, what I have to do after the first, I've talked about the first 6 pages, then the first 8 pages. My job now is to make Tony into a good guy. Now, this is hard because a lot of people are reading the book saying, this guy's a creep. And this guy should just go away. And there's nothing to be said for him. But if that's all he is, then there's no novel.
Right.
Because all the time the reader has to know there's a place she can always go back to. Which is him. He's really sorry. At least he seems so. He's incredibly nice with his children. The important thing is that he would be incredibly nice with his daughter. That they get on really well. There's the whole. I want to build a sense of him as someone who is the opposite to something that he did. So it'd be so easy to make him into. Look, he behaved so badly. She left, that's not good. That's not a novel. So that her leaving was done on an impulse, maybe. I mean, her going to Ireland, but
Right.
all the time, there's another current in the book, which is happening almost without me needing to mention it. But that's another aspect of these men that they can be, that you can change them, you can play with them in a way you can't with the women.
Right. Which is fun to read.
It's fun to write sometimes,
Yeah.
actually, oddly enough, just get these guys.
I think we have some Long Island folks in the audience. Why was Lyndhurst chosen as the community the family lived in?
I just used to go out on the train on my own and walk around, just get off at stations and walk around and look at places. I had to stop doing this because there's nothing more suspicious looking than me walking around at like 4 o'clock in the afternoon from like street to street. There was no one else walking. So luckily I got a friend with a car, even the two of us, I have to say, two blokes driving around. But eventually we got used to it, and I found the place I thought I was looking for.
Yep.
What I was looking for, I think it gets mentioned once or twice in the book, is the element of light from the ocean.
Yeah.
Of just that she gets some sort of light is coming in. And that also I found the cul-de-sac. I could take you to it. And
No, we would get stopped.
So that's really, there's no other reason really.
No, the light does fall differently when you're by the water, and obviously Enniscorthy and the way you write
Yeah.
about all of those places.
You see, Enniscorthy is not on the water.
It's
and Lyndhurst-
not?
No,
Why
it's
did-
about 10 miles. But you still, you always have that sense.
because
it's on
I'm
the
always
river.
thinking that, I'm thinking that they're always right by
Yeah,
the
they are.
beach because everyone's going off to the
Yeah,
houses.
but it's 10 miles away.
Okay,
So,
well,
it's not,
This is why I should not be handed the map. This is really what it comes down to. But
No, but I'm saying that Lindenhurst has the same thing where
Yeah.
that there's a distance.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
nonetheless, whatever way clouds blow and the sky is, it's close to water in the same way.
we have a couple of questions, though, about the earlier historicals. And so let's go back to Henry James for a second. Let's go back to Thomas Mann for a second. When you're writing a character like that versus Eilish, because obviously Eilish is familiar to you in a way that even when you read the novels of Mann, or even when you read the novels of Henry James, especially the way you read, you still don't necessarily, they're still separate from you, right? And you've got to give them an interior life. You've got to give them dialogue. You've got to give them context that isn't just, and then I read in this book, once he walked down the street on a Tuesday. You need to give it life.
Yeah, I mean, I think Henry James himself perfected the idea of third-person intimate.
Yep.
That by not writing I or we, by writing he or she, the theory of this is that you stick to point of view, and everything the person remembers, sees, notices, feels is registered. And slowly the theory is that the reader should become that person, or turn the page immersed in that person's, I suppose, mind, sensibility, experience, and then want to know, not merely want to know, but want to be is in the book enough so that experiences really matter.
Right.
So James is not the one who did this first, but he's the one who perfected it, I think. And so what I was doing with him was just doing the same thing back, and seeing where that would take me. With the Thomas Mann, it's a much more social book because he happens to have, it's a real problem if you're writing a novel and the character has 6 children, because you really should narrow that down to 3, or maybe 2 children. And but because it's a serious character out of history who's known to have 6 children, you can't just decide to cut Michael or Monica out of the book. And keeping 6 children going is like adding, and too much to a juggler's set of tricks. And but you do have to work with that.
Yeah.
And also, it's a much more social book in that sometimes there wasn't enough of him there. He was so distant from everything that was happening that just bringing basically all I did is any time there was a crisis in the narrative, I mean, in the sort of rhythms of the narrative, I just brought his wife into the room or his daughter into the room and got him to say something either provocative or funny or ironic or commentary, and got him to say nothing. And so I was back in Enniscorthy,
Yeah.
in that house where upstairs the women are talking, downstairs the men are sitting there. And suddenly it was Thomas Mann and his daughter and his wife. And basically that's what I did for a whole book. Yeah.
And it worked.
Well, I don't know. I mean, the First World War, the Second World War, the Cold War, all those wars.
There was a lot happening, but it worked. But
I mean, it's interesting in that Henry James is born in 1843 and dies in 1916. Mann is born in 1875 and dies in, 1955. Yes, that's right. And the ways in which war affected Mann, like his whole life was dictated by what happened in 1914. And then by the slow rise of Hitler, by German nationalism, by inflation, and then by the actual Hitler in power, then by the Second World War, and then by, of all things, the Cold War forced him out of America. I mean, he was denounced in Congress for being a communist, of all people. And his daughter was going to be deported. You know, this is like his daughter, Erica Mann, who had been and one of the reasons she was going to be deported was that she was considered in America to have been an anti-fascist too early, which is a good way of putting it, you know. In other words, she was an heroic figure in the Germany of her time. And so that you have to be very careful as well not to start getting, I've just become indignant, but that the novel can't do this. You know, you have to really watch it. You just have to let the thing happen and see where it will take you. But see where the narrative will take you, bringing his wife into the room further to say various things to him. You know.
But it does give the novel an authentic feel. And by that, I mean emotional authenticity. I mean, we're sitting there saying, okay, I understand what the stakes are. It is true. I would like my novelist to not be histrionic. I do, like, just please lay the story out for me and let me figure out how I feel about the thing. But I do, when I'm reading you, I get very emotionally attached to people I'm not expecting to get emotionally attached to. Thomas Mann was not someone I was thinking, I need this book. And of course I start reading because this man's byline is on it, and we go from there. But Henry James, you got me to read The Bostonians. That might be my limit.
Great.
That might be my limit.
Hold on. Have you, by any... hold on. Let's just be clear. Let's just see where we are now. Have you, by any chance, not read... I'm not going to even list the books you haven't read, but are there James novels you have not read?
There are many, but I did recently buy a copy of The Ambassadors because someone may have written a new introduction to it, and it's a very pretty package.
Oh,
it may be sitting on my desk at the office.
I'm all for you finishing that by the next time we meet.
And
in public, so I can hold you to it. And we can take you through.
Apparently, this is how I am going to get the classics read. I'm just going to keep making
dates.
Either
there's a full book or a really long essay on the first sentence of The Ambassadors.
Seriously?
Yeah, that is all. I think is it by Ian Watt? I bet there's someone here who knows that. Ian Watt was an English literary critic. Are you nodding? No, but he wrote a whole essay on... and when I was in university, it was almost mandatory to know that first sentence. Do you know it, Nan? Does anyone know it?
Mm-mm.
What?
Can't do it.
The first sentence.
No, I used to be able to recite the last paragraph of John Cheever's Wapshot Chronicle.
Really?
That's a really
can
useless
you still do
skill. I can't do it. I can tell you fear tastes like a rusty knife and you should never let her into your mouth. That's the only line.
Is that in?
That's in that last paragraph.
Wow.
It's Leander's letter to his sons. And it's something also about not mixing your booze and sleeping with a window open. And it's a very Bostonian thing.
Yes.
It's kind of like a handbook to a certain generation of men. Listen, we do what we can to figure you out.
Cheever.
I still love Cheever. Yeah. Still. I might be the only one, but I still...
Falconer.
Okay, no.
Falconer is a great novel.
Falconer's great.
Hey.
Wapshot. The stories are must see.
You know that one where he swims in every swimming pool?
Oh. You know what? We should actually maybe have you sign some books. Because you and I, we could take this on the road.
Before we go any further, today, everyone knows what today's anniversary is. 100 years since the publication today.
Great Gatsby.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we can all quote that line, too, about Tom and Daisy breaking everything and running away.
Yeah, but speaking of last sentences.
This is what happens when you let book nerds share a microphone. And also, we did have a little practice 5 weeks ago. We really should take this on the road again.
We will.
We can.
When you've read the Henry James.
I
books we
will.
mentioned.
I mean, apparently, this is how I'm going to get the classics done. I'm just going to
Yes.
keep making dates with you.
That's right.
And I will continue to read
I'm up
all
for
of the
that.
things. Okay. Well, this
Yeah.
is what happens when you're a history major. You miss some other things.
Ah,
Right.
okay, okay.
I had a couple of other things I had to.
Okay.
You know, there's some stuff that. So on that note, I think we are going to do
Hey,
a little
thank you
bit
very
of a
much.
signing.
Thank
It's
you.
always good to
Thank
see
you.
you. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you.
Colm Tóibín, give us 2 seconds to set up the signing. Thank you, New York. It's always good to see you.
Thank you.